now is actually look at the broader international aspects. And I've chosen especially to look at three what I consider to be interconnected aspects. The military and civil interdependencies in nuclear politics, the changes from when we saw the NPT and the international, that's the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, particularly in the period 2005 to 2010, and it kind of reached its peak at the 2010 NPT Review Conference, with a number of states parties really pushing for nuclear renaissance rhetoric, and then seeing how that has slumped as people and governments are now seeking alternatives following the terrible Fukushima accident. And then also I'll have some slides on the major decline in nuclear construction and investments after Fukushima. But first, I think we need to just recall a bit of history here. This is excerpts from Eisenhower's, or this relates to President Eisenhower of the US's Atoms for Peace speech in 1953. And as you can see, it's really presented as very much in terms of, sorry, that should not have happened, in terms of public relations, to present nuclear technologies as atoms for peace, and to take the heat off the growing opposition to nuclear weapons as more became known about what happened to the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as there was a growing international public protest around the world against the nuclear testing that was taking place in many different places, the Pacific, Kazakhstan, in the Arctic, often on indigenous lands, in Xinjiang province and so on, by the major nuclear states. Of course, China and France hadn't actually joined that club in the 1950s, but the UK did join in 1952, actually on my very birthday. But why this is important, and I will come back to it at the end, but really this purpose was PR, but it was also financial. It was also to endorse the production. And in the UK, and I'll be interested to know if the research has been done, whether this happened in other countries, but certainly in the UK, we now know that before the UK joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, successive UK governments used to actually hide the actual costs of building both the nuclear weapons and the gradual investment and costs going into nuclear power production. Whenever there was scrutiny in Parliament, the budget that would be presented, if the scrutiny was about the defense budget, then all of the aspects of nuclear construction that was feeding into the nuclear weapons would actually be hidden, taken out of the defense budget and put into an energy budget that was not being scrutinized. And then if the high costs of constructing nuclear power plants was being scrutinized, those costs went jumping back into defense, where they were then hidden again. So you got this kind of concealment and juggling. And we also need to know, and again, I'll mention this in a slide later, but one of the most serious, I think probably the first really serious nuclear accident in the world, resulting in releases of radioactive material and contamination of the environment and food, was in 1957 at the reprocessing plant in the UK called Windscale. But this was all hushed up, it was all covered up. And in fact, in order to carry on with Windscale making the plutonium for the UK's nuclear weapons, in a few years, the name was changed to Sellafield. And as we know, Sellafield has actually carried on having quite a lot of accidents, though none as serious as the one in 1957. And so this was, it was a PR to change the name rather than changing the fact that the reprocessing of nuclear materials for the nuclear bombs and also for the more sophisticated nuclear power reactors that were coming on stream was at the same place. And it only got delinked, at least officially, the nuclear weapons and the nuclear energy programs only got delinked in the UK at the time of joining the NPT, and in some countries has actually carried on not being properly delinked at all, India being a case in point. And I also just want to remind us of, who has the major nuclear weapons and the kind of size of arsenal, because this is relevant to what I want to talk about. And with the definite exception of the US, which we know first did a nuclear weapons program and then only afterwards started talking about atoms for peace. And we think also Russia was basically first committed as a Soviet Union to the nuclear weapons and then also started to build nuclear energy. All of the other nuclear armed states actually started out with nuclear energy and nuclear weapons being absolutely interconnected in the technologies, in policy, and so on. So my next slide looks at the power construction and investments. Kinchi at the very beginning said to us, well, who benefits? Let's look at who benefits nuclear power. And follow the money is a useful way to look at this, but also follow the politics. And Michael Schneider of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report has been analyzing the status of the world nuclear industry primarily from both economic and safety angles for many, 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 many years. And he's a good friend, and we both currently serve on the International Panel on Fissile Materials based at Princeton. So when I knew I was going to be doing this presentation, I actually contacted him to get the very latest. And I thought it was very interesting that he confirmed, and they're going to be, I think, bringing this research out in the future, actually 9 in 10 nuclear power units, as he calls them, started up in the past decade, were either built in nuclear armed states or by companies that are controlled by nuclear armed states in other countries. And I think that's really significant. Now, the next two generation with major renewable and sustainable energy generation, and then the one after that will look at global energy prices over the last decade. So here, when you look from 2000 to 2017, what you really see is a clear drop in nuclear power generation worldwide after 2011, 2012, as the impact of the Fukushima accident begins to really bite into public consciousness, political concerns and worries, and costs, and the need to check on safety to a far higher degree than had been done before. And although there has been a gradual rise, that nuclear has actually not attained its pre-2011 levels. And then this one on energy prices comes right up to 2020, and again is provided to me by Michael Schneider of World Nuclear Industry Status Report. And here again, if you're looking at the price and the costs, you're seeing the price of nuclear power per unit of electricity is rising. And again, this is across the world. So it's more in some countries, less in others. But this is the overall look of this, as the prices of solar and wind energy are dropping. And the greenhouse gas major emitters, the coal and gas industries, they're roughly maintaining where they are. So we're not really doing a very good job about divesting from the coal and gas yet, which we have to do, which we need to do to stop runaway climate destruction and climate chaos. But we are seeing much greater investment and therefore greatly lowering costs on solar and wind, the major practical renewable energies. And I have to pay tribute to a large extent on China for driving this, for really waking up and bringing down, you know, their investment in their own national industries of that actually brought the much needed drop in unit prices for wind and solar technologies. And that's really been welcomed around the world. It's really fed into all the industries in the different countries. So now, so that's really looking at that question of do we need nuclear power to answer the climate concern, because that's how nuclear power, nuclear energy has been fed to us really since we began to wake up to climate destruction and climate chaos. Many have thought so, but if you look at those slides on cost and you think about the hidden costs of nuclear power plant construction, and well, the known and some of these hidden military costs, and you look then also at the proliferation political costs, the answer has got to be no. It's not the right answer for a world that is needing to cooperate and together collectively tackle climate destruction. Well, anyone who knows me wouldn't be surprised that I have to bring the NPT in, but it's important in this context because we saw from 2005 to 2010 this real almost triumphalism about the nuclear renaissance, and it came to a head in the 2010 review conference, and it was really pushed by a small number of nuclear power producers and governments, including particularly France, Russia, Japan, the United States, China too, although China was less public, less overt. And there was also a handful of NAM states, notably I would say Iran, possibly we would bring also Brazil into this, who were turning Article 4 compliance, this inalienable right, complying with the nuclear technology exchange, if you like, and in Article 4 as a litmus test of NPT compliance, taking it far above what they were actually considering to be the litmus test, which was the nuclear disarmament obligations in Article 6, that for most of the world used to be it. And you see this language in the 2010 review conference, which also had an unprecedented 18 action points on nuclear energy, where usually nuclear energy would have some bland sort of action points, sort of calling on the IAEA to carry on doing a good job and all of this, and also mentioning to a far greater degree concerns about safety, concerns about security, and also medical, other, you know, agricultural, other small-scale technological needs that the IAEA does do a lot of cooperative activities with many countries. But we did find in 2010, perhaps prophetically, sadly prophetically, they did note the global, that a demonstrated global record of safety is a key element of the continuing uses of peaceful nuclear energy and continuous effects are required to ensure that. And this is really what the terrible accident at Fukushima in 2011, less than a year later, really they blew that wide open. But Fukushima is not a one-off. I think it's really important to recognize this. It's part of a shocking list of accidents that have caused significant radio releases and radioactive contamination of environments and food resources. And I mentioned the October 10th in 1957, and this was later rated as having been a 0.5 on the logarithmic nuclear and radiological event scale, INES, which was actually only founded in 1990. So this is a belated assessment that this was a Mark V. The 3 Mile Island accident in 1978 in the US, also rated as INES 5. Then we come to 1986 and Chernobyl. And this horrendous accident, which most seriously contaminated Belarus and Ukraine, when it was still they were still in the Soviet Union, that was rated 7, which was the maximum allowable, the maximum under the INES logarithmic scale. And then, of course, as we know, Fukushima was also rated 7. But Fukushima and Chernobyl are really very different, and that has led to some critiques and criticisms of that particular INES logarithmic scale, and concerns to try to look at accidents in a wider, perhaps more accurate way, so that we can measure them, but also so that we can identify what would be required for emergency planning. And then this slide just shows just the vast quantity of different kinds of reactor core damage, different designs, different manufacturers. You know, you have to look at them all together. You can't just, you know, blame the human error of Chernobyl or the terrible tsunami overwhelming Fukushima. So the next set of slides I want to show are, I'm returning to the UK, but these are actually very interesting to see how Fukushima then became brought into studies by nuclear engineers, in this case, called Large and Associates. John Large is probably quite well known to anyone who's looked at these kinds of nuclear issues. I know he's been an advisor to a number of governments, both before and after Fukushima, and indeed in the UK. He's also been an advisor for local authorities concerned about emergency planning, again, prior to and subsequent to Fukushima. But in this particular case, what I found particularly interesting about what he was studying, and in fact, after he'd done this report, in 2013, the Acronym Institute and another ICAN partner who were trying to raise humanitarian awareness of the dangers and costs, humanitarian risks and costs of nuclear weapons, and in particular of UK nuclear weapons or a nuclear strike on the UK. We actually republished his report, as part of the humanitarian disarmament awareness raising of all the kinds of all aspects of the nuclear industries. But this particular report he actually did in relation to regulation at AWE Aldermaston and Burfield, which are only about 50 miles west of London, and are the two major nuclear bomb factories in the UK, and have been since the 1950s, and still are making the next generation, modernizing the warheads for the next generation of British nuclear weapons. And what John Large did in this was he used images from Fukushima, the evacuation of people, and this particular one really very compelling for a British audience, and I would say for all audiences, seeing a small child with his hands up, probably thinking he's got a gun pointing at him or something, you know, who is being tested for radioactivity after Fukushima. These are really important to see, therefore, how this has all played together. Also, in civil societies, increased public opposition to new nuclear construction has grown stronger, also as public opposition to nuclear weapons, and indeed public work for and support public and political and parliamentarians and governments' work, which achieved the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. So the last couple of slides before I come to the conclusion are just from a study, a very useful study in 2018 by two colleagues up at the University of Sussex nearby, Andy Sterling and Phil Johnston. And they are looking at this, they did a very serious piece of research that got, you know, they also contributed to parliamentary inquiries, and noted the growing the nuclear infrastructure, kind of the sharing, both the necessity for large-scale national base of highly specialized nuclear-specific skills, research, training, design, you know, you name it, all of these things that also engineering, industrial and regulatory capabilities. And they also looked specifically at the UK construction of the first new nuclear plant construction is Hinkley C, which is massive majority within the UK absolutely opposes. It's sited on the Bristol Channel, which faces out to the Atlantic. The Bristol Channel has had flooding, is an area prone to flooding. Of course, we are not volcanic in the way that Japan is in terms of earthquakes, but this site really bears some resemblances to Fukushima. And the French and the Chinese were supposed to go into partnership because the UK does no longer have the expertise or be able to do a cost-effective construction. The French had to pull out. It's now left to the Chinese. There's been all kinds of problems, political and even more substantive than that. So, but what they recognize is the seriously unfavorable costs of constructing this appears to be having little effect on the intensity of UK government commitments to nuclear power. And again, we have to ask why. And the answer really has got to be connected in with Britain's desperate desire to keep deploying nuclear weapons and to have the status that they attach to that. So Sterling and Johnson say the persistence of these nuclear attachments, despite the adverse economics, and I would have added if I were them, and safety concerns, is partly due to a perceived need to subsidize the costs. So it gets subsidized by the electricity consumers, by the public, to keep nuclear submarines afloat, whatever that's going to cost. And so the Atoms for Peace promises of 1953, sorry, that date mistake, are not actually believed, but they are still part of the PR that is driving nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And Caroline Lucas put it very well. The only way that I think we can explain the ideological obsession with Hinkley nuclear power in general is because of the cross subsidy between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And one photo shows her speaking at a climate and ecological emergency demonstration in Bristol, which is just a few miles away from Hinkley-C. Also shows the wind farm that's directly outside my living room window that I can see as I'm talking to you, which I love. And I love this quote from Lao Tzu: "When storms come, some build walls, some are thrown by the wind, others build windmills. So let's all be windmill builders." And here come my conclusions. So my first conclusion is that Fukushima has had massive, wide international impacts. It has shocked investors as well as public and politicians. Having fallen off the perch it had been put on by nuclear governments in industries, particularly through the nuclear renaissance rhetoric of 2005 to 2011, to prior to Fukushima, as the energy solution to climate fears and best alternative to fossil fuels. Secondly, investment flowed into sustainable renewable energy production after 2011. And that's also been in large part, certainly in many countries, due not only to climate concerns, although that's been a big part of it, but also due to Fukushima's terrible reminder of nuclear risks. And the issue of nuclear renaissance. In 2015, already we saw more focus on safety, security, and IAEA support for medical and other small-scale nuclear uses. And it remains to be seen what will happen in the postponed 2020 NPT review conference that we think now is going to be held, COVID permitting, in January of 2022. But we don't yet know for certain. My reflections also include Fukushima Hibakusha. This was a phrase that began to be talked about, certainly in the humanitarian community and humanitarian disarmament communities. Fukushima Hibakusha put international spotlight on humanitarian consequences of both civil and military nuclear accidents, significantly increasing public rejection of nuclear power construction along with nuclear weapons, and that these humanitarian and environmental concerns became embedded in ICAN's disarmament campaign that built momentum for the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And here we see Hiroshima survivor, who was only 13 when the Hiroshima bomb destroyed her school. She was one of only 3 girls that survived that attack. And here she is, Setsuko, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN on the 10th of December, 2017. And my final slide, before I get to 3 slides that have just the reading lists and resources. My questions: when and where will the next nuclear catastrophe occur, and why? Next, though little, if any, credibility is left in economic, environmental, energy and climate cases for nuclear power generation, which are now widely recognized as not that cheap, safe, clean, disposable or renewable energy that everybody was talking about back in the 60s, 70s, and on up with the nuclear renaissance. This dangerous, and we have to see it as a 20th century technology, is still proliferating in some parts of the world, largely due to nuclear armed states and what I call the MEBA, the military, industrial, bureaucratic, academic networks and institutions that actually interconnect among nuclear armed states across the world that maintain and modernize nuclear arsenals. And then another question for us all. What more needs to be done to prevent the next nuclear catastrophe from happening? And when I think about nuclear catastrophe, I'm including the use of a nuclear weapon, accidents involving either nuclear weapons or the nuclear weapon construction facilities, and or nuclear power. And finally, will ongoing Fukushima, this I've already mentioned this one, how will it play into the 2020 review conference, and also the TPNW first meeting of states parties, now that it has entered into legal force, which was scheduled for the second week of January. And again, if the NPT is going to be in January, there are negotiations on how to fit both of those very important conferences in the international disarmament calendar in early 2022. And I'll end there just with my thank yous to all of you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.